Hi, this is Emily Midgett of Sixth Street Sundries. Today, in my very first video, I'm going to show you my method for achieving depths and shadows with your Zig markers using 1, 2, or 3 markers. Let's get started. For my watercoloring today, I've chosen to work with Canson Monteval watercolor paper, which I find to be very forgiving with zigs. A number 4 round silver paintbrush, an absorber, clean clear water, Ellen Hudson's Mondo Peony set, and light violet, purple, and violet Zig markers. I've heat embossed one of the peonies and a bud, as well as some foliage from the Ellen Hudson set using gold embossing powder. To start, I've prepped my work area by placing my damp absorber and clean water to the side. I've used some painter's tape to adhere my embossed floral panel to a small cutting board so that the paper doesn't warp or move unexpectedly. My philosophy on coloring flowers is pretty simple. Concentrate the color toward the center of the flower, which is where the shadows would be darkest and therefore the color would be most intense. With Zig markers, it's pretty easy to control where the color goes, since you put the pigment directly onto the paper. I choose to concentrate the color towards where the petal would attach to the flower, then use my damp paintbrush to pull the color out and create a nice fade. It's a good idea to keep your paintbrush damp, but not saturated, as it's easy to add more water, but it's a bit more challenging to take it off of the paper. For this first layer, I'm simply laying down some light violet towards the center of the flower on each individual petal, then pulling the color out with my damp paintbrush. I find that with zigs, layers of color are key to getting good shadows and depth. I simply add the color to the petal, then use the very tip of my damp paintbrush to pull the color out. I find that using a light hand and just putting the tip of the brush to the paper, rather than just smushing the entire brush down, gives me more control over where the color is going and how much fade is being achieved. You will notice that I'm turning the cutting board around frequently. This is because the direction that the petal is curved changes with each petal, and therefore the spot that is most concentrated with color changes with each petal as well. Deciding where you feel the most color concentrated areas are on each petal is one of the decisions you will have to make when coloring your flower. I also find that it helps to have the cutting board slightly elevated at an angle with the paintbrush pointed away from me so that gravity can help me pull the color out smoothly and organically with few blotches or blooms. For layer 2, at the start, the flower with just one layer of color might look okay, right? You could definitely leave it like this and it would be just fine. But, like I mentioned earlier, I find that layers of color are key to getting great results with your Zig markers. For this second layer, I'm adding a bit of purple Zig marker on top of the light violet. It's a medium purple shade. The middle shade is just as important as the lightest or darkest. In my opinion, subtle gradation of color is so important. I'm adding the purple Zig in essentially the same areas as I did the light violet, just with slightly less pigment being laid down initially. I don't want to cover up the light violet coloring entirely, just to add a bit more depth. Real flowers have so many levels of color intensity that it makes sense, at least to me, to have many layers of color to create that same intensity. You may also notice that I'm blotting my paintbrush more often than I had with the previous color. Because the color itself is more intense, and because I don't want to cover up all of the light violet layer, I want to keep that bright, intense purple layer just towards the center of the flower. In order to do that, once I have started moving the color with my paintbrush, I clean that excess of color off of my paintbrush by dabbing it on my wet absorber. There are some times when I have too much water on my brush and so too much color gets pulled out from the center, creating a more one-dimensional look. In those cases, I get my paintbrush very wet and scrub the mistake, then quickly dry my brush on my absorber and put it back to the very wet paper. The dry brush will sort of vacuum the water and take the color with it, leaving you with a fairly clean area to start over. You have to have good watercolor paper for this, and I'll get to my thoughts on that in a minute. Layer 3. Look at how much more intense and how much depth adding just that second layer of color provided. You could certainly leave it like this with only 2 layers of color with no problem, but wait until you see the intensity after adding just a tiny bit of the darkest shade of our trio. For this last step, we're going to add a smidgen of violet zig to our petals. For this step, you want to be sure to add just a tiny bit of this dark purple, because too much of this intense color will change the color of the entire petal. Add color only to the darkest parts of the flower, where there are sure to be shadows or where the petal is attached to the flower itself. As the petals unfurl, the color naturally gets lighter. The larger the petal, the less concentrated the color is, because it has more surface area to spread. Though I have absolutely no idea if that is biologically the case, just how I rationalize my blending choices. For the smaller, more interior petals, I find that the color is more intense naturally, and so therefore gets more of this darkest shade of purple. This is where having good quality watercolor paper becomes so important. I've tried many different brands of watercolor paper, and I have to say that I found that Canson Montval is my absolute favorite for working with Zig markers. The color doesn't sink down into the paper immediately, which means that you can manipulate it with your damp paintbrush for longer without having to worry about harsh lines where you initially laid down the color. The other reason that I love Canson Montval watercolor paper is that it holds water beautifully. You don't have to worry about it pilling when you add multiple layers of color because the water saturation does not break down the fibers very easily. So you can add numerous layers of color without having to worry about it damaging the paper. When adding many layers of color to a watercolored piece, I prefer to blend each layer of color out on each petal regardless of whether I am adding only a tiny bit of pigment, as I am on this third layer. I find that if I blend the color out with just clean, clear water, I can avoid those harsh water lines that occur if I were to only blend half of the petal. I start by pulling out the color with my damp paintbrush just a bit, then dabbing the color off of my wet paintbrush onto my absorber, possibly even cleaning it again in my water jar, then pulling the color out again with my clean brush until I've basically gotten the entire petal wet again. Adding all of these layers may seem tedious to some, but I find that I am so much more pleased with the results when I have many layers of color that I don't mind the extra bit of time it takes. Now to finish the card. I fussy cut the large peony, bud, and foliage, but you could also use the dies if you have them. I arranged them in a cluster the way I wanted them to be placed on an A2 card front, then used press and seal to pick them up so that I could add some Scotch tape to hold my cluster in place. I trimmed down a black and white striped panel and added a strip of glitzy fuchsia glitter paper to the bottom. I added several strips of dimensional adhesive to the back and adhered it to a panel of lavender cardstock. I heat embossed a sentiment from Concord & Knight's Kind Hearted stamp set onto a strip of heavyweight vellum using gold embossing powder. After adhering my striped panel to my card base, I used both dimensional and liquid adhesive to adhere my watercolored peonies to the card front while still attached to the press and seal. After it had sufficiently dried, I peeled my press and seal away and added my vellum sentiment strip, hiding the adhesive behind the peony bud. And that's it. I hope that I've given you a few helpful tips to take your Zig watercoloring up a notch. Have a wonderful day, and if you like my first video, be sure to give me a thumbs up and come visit me at my blog, ebelymidgett.com. Thanks for watching.